Good morning, good morning. Glad you're all here. Welcome back. Week 3 of our discussion of the polity of Anglicanism and how the polity helps shape what we do in the world. So less of a history about how Anglicanism develops, but more of like what is the structure and what does that structure tell us about how we move and work in the world. So last week we did a little more of the history side of things, so thinking about how we get to what we call the Anglican Communion, which is the 42 different provinces, autonomous provinces that make their own choices but have a shared history. So like we discussed, here's our 42 provinces here. We've got the Episcopal Church here and up in Alaska and a couple different places, this is a helpfully colored-coded map. So each different color that you see on the map is a different Anglican province. So we've got the Episcopal Church, you've got the Church of England up there. Russia is red. Why is Russia red, Ginny?
We didn't speak about that. There is a small presence in Russia. It's a little distorted because Russia is so big that the whole country is colored red, but there is a small presence.
Okay, that's helpful. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the American or the Episcopal Church here, our province. We'll talk a little bit about the Church of England and a little bit about the province of Southern Africa. So just keep those in mind as we're looking at and talking about different things here. So one province here, one province here, and then one province down there.
Part of South America, part of our province.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Hold your questions. All right. So,
There was one. I lived in the Netherlands for 6 years, and my vision's not so good from here. But I think the Netherlands is a different color than most of the. No, okay, it must be my eyes.
The stripe is where the Church of England and the Episcopal Church exist.
well, and it's odd to have two provinces in one area, which is again something that we're going to discuss in just a second. So this map is available online. You can go and find it and look at all the different colors and the pretty color coding. And these are words. They're not just lines down there. They're words. So you can look at all the different names as well. I know that some of this stuff is small, so I apologize. But so just as a refresher, we talked about how the Anglican Communion has shared heritage and history. We are all descendant from the Church of England. So every church in the Anglican Communion can trace their roots back to the Church of England. We have a similar governing structure. That is to say, we have an episcopal structure, meaning that we have the authority and structure of bishops that define how our churches operate. That is different from governance. We do not have shared governance. We are autonomous. The Episcopal Church does not have to abide by the same decisions that the Church of England abides by. We'll talk about that. We have shared worship, liturgy, prayer life. So being that we are all descendant from the Church of England, we have the Book of Common Prayer, this Western Christianity line of thought and prayer that we have is structured kind of throughout how we do our prayers. So when you take the BCP, when you worship with us at 10:15 or at the 8 o'clock or any service, you're worshiping with tens of millions of Anglicans that are using a similar structure to pray in the morning. So that's important. But most importantly, we have shared relationships. And so relationships are going to come into a key piece of what we're discussing today. So we don't have shared governance or hierarchy. And that is to say that there is no central authority within the Anglican Communion. Because all of the different provinces are autonomous, they're free to make their own decisions in their own ways. But they are guided by the recommendations of what we call the 4 instruments of communion. So that's the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lambeth Conference, which we've talked a little bit about, the primates meeting. So a primate is essentially the most senior ranking bishop in a province. So for us, the primate is the presiding bishop, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Other provinces, you'll hear the term archbishop, which is the same thing. So the primate is that senior official of the church. So the primates meeting. and then the Anglican Consultative Council. And these are in order of when they develop within the history. So these are in a little bit of a timeline here. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as we talked about when Dean Willis was here, goes all the way back to when the first Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name was Augustine. Augustine. The Archbishop of Canterbury has been a seat that goes all the way back to when Augustine is sent by the Pope to go to the English territories. So he settles there in Canterbury. Bertha is the queen who was already Christian. So there's a chapel there in Canterbury that is it is the oldest continuously speaking English chapel in continuous use, and it's from the 400s, and it is incredible to go there and worship. So if you ever have the chance, which I hope you do, go with the choir in 2025, you can go to this chapel that is got nearly 1,600, 1,700 years of Anglican history with it. It's fascinating. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is that primate. So he's the first primate. His title is the first among equals. So when all the bishops of the Anglican Communion get together, even though they all technically have a very similar rank, he is the spiritual figurehead. So it's not like the Pope, where the Pope has authority to say, you do this, you do this. The power of the Archbishop of Canterbury is essentially just that relationship. So it's saying that we're going to work together. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury calls all of the other meetings, essentially. So he puts together the Lambeth Conference, which meets at his palace, essentially, but now meets in Canterbury because his palace isn't very big. But the Lambeth Palace is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Let's talk about the Lambeth Conference. So the Lambeth Conference, like we talked a little bit last week, is a conference that gets together every 10 years or so, and it is every bishop within the Anglican Communion that attends this. So because the churches are autonomous, this does not necessarily set policy for the church, but it talks about shared ways of being in ministry and how the different and contextual natures of ministry inform what we're doing as a global communion. So essentially, part of what the Anglican Communion is strength in numbers. If you can get 10 million people to share a similar value and to work towards a common goal, you can get a lot done. So part of what the Lambeth Conference is trying to do is steer the direction of the church to be in ministry throughout the world. So it's a fascinating conference. Jenny and I got to go in 2022 as not official observers, but we got to observe lots of things. It's very hard to get in because of the nature of the work, because of the discussions that they have. A lot of it is closed off so that bishops can speak freely and have conversations that are not being constantly monitored by the outside world. So a lot of it is closed off, but the work that happens there is really fascinating. And it's just really funny to be in Canterbury and see a bus of bishops pull up, and it's just like a clown car. They just keep coming out. They just keep coming out. It doesn't stop. Because we're talking thousands and thousands of bishops come to this. So it's a very cool thing to witness and to experience. And so that happens roughly every 10 years. We're going to look at the most recent history of this in just a second with a case study we're going to look at.
How many bishops are there?
There are thousands of bishops. I don't know the exact number. And there are new dioceses coming up.
Yeah, so 42 individual provinces, and each of those provinces is made up of however many dioceses are made up in that particular province. In the U.S., we have a couple hundred. So think of that times 42. You get a lot of bishops. So each diocese has a bishop. Some dioceses have multiple bishops. Then you get retired bishops that are coming as well. And so it creates quite a large group of people as well. And so they are not able to hold it at the palace. They hold it at the University of Kent, which is in Canterbury. So they kick all the students out for the summer, and they use the dorms there to house all the bishops. So it's a fascinating conference. The Anglican Consultative Council, so I should say, Lambeth starts to come in about the 1800s. So 1860s, 1870s is when the first Lambeth Conference happened, and has happened every 10 years since. Anglican Consultative Council, as you'll see down here, starts about 1971. This is a really interesting body because it is the only body that is technically elected by all of the different provinces to send their own representation, which is good. It's also the only instrument of communion that includes that fourfold order of ministry that we were talking about. So it's the only order that includes lay individuals in some of the deliberative body of the church. So you have these representatives from all the different provinces. I think they get one bishop, one priest, and one layperson. So one either priest or deacon to then come and represent the church. A lot of the work that they do is in between Lambeth conferences. Because those are spaced out every 10 years, this is a yearly meeting where they get together. Is it yearly? Every 3 years. See, that's why I have Jenny here to give me the real scoop here. And so they do some deliberative work, and they kind of move the life of the church in between Lambeth meetings and set some of the tones that can't be set at the Lambeth meeting. So this is a really important body as well. The primates meeting is kind of the last to evolve, but as an instrument of communion, we talked about, again, those primates as being the figureheads, or not the figureheads, but the actual heads of each of the individual autonomous provinces. So those primates of the 42 provinces get together for what is known as the primates meeting, and it's just a different level of conversation that they get to have. How often does that meet, Janine? That meets every year. There we go. So there we go. That's setting every year. Questions about the primates or any of the instruments of communion quickly before we move on to something else.
What are the four things, four types? I think you mentioned.
We're going to talk about that in just a second. So yeah, put a pin in that one.
How is the information that comes from these meetings promulgated to the faithful?
It depends. So Lambeth, there's a lot of intentional communications that come out of it.
Are there official minutes? I mean, is
There are official documents that come out of it to say, and we're going to look at one of those as a case study in a second, so how they kind of disseminate the conversations that they have to steer the church. Lambeth does a good job of that. There are specific minutes to the ACC meetings. They have bylaws, so the Consultative Council does send out stuff, and you can look at that online. It's all available. You can look at their entire meeting. They just had one in 2022?
Last year,
Yeah.
There are resolutions that come out of the Anglican Consultative Council. They're obviously not binding, but there are things that we tend to take at our general convention and either affirm or not things from the Anglican Consultative Council, so that if our general convention does affirm it, then we can then act on it in that way.
It's interesting.
Which one makes these decisions that can be, highly political, such as women coming in or gay clergy?
It's a great question. We're going to get to it in just a second. Yeah. So because of the autonomous nature, no one body is making that decision. It's actually each province that gets to have that conversation. So we're going to look at that. Yeah, we're going to look at that. So that gets to the question of how do we make decisions? You guys are reading my mind. It's a perfect segue. So I think to do this properly, we need to understand a little bit of the hierarchy of our own church. So again, we're going to look at this really quickly, and hopefully I can, so there you go. It depends on where you are. That's how we make decisions. So we've got our 42 different provinces here, and each province has its own method of making decisions. So the Episcopal Church is unique. So all of the provinces are going to have this fourfold order of ministry. So you have the lay people, you have bishops, you have priests, and you have deacons. Those are the four orders of ministry that we hold as Anglicans. And a lot of Christianity holds this as well. So these fourfold laity. And if you look in the catechism in the back of the BCP, if you look at the definition for what each of the orders is supposed to do, the first sentence always starts with this: the ministry of blank is to represent Christ and his church. And so then it breaks it down from there. But just thinking about this isn't necessarily hierarchy. What I like to note is that each of the different orders has a very specific role within our structure to play. And so a bishop doesn't necessarily have more power than any of the lay people, but in some of the decision making, they have a very specific role. Same with priests, same with deacons. So everybody gets a voice, and that's what we're trying to kind of set up here and note. So in the Episcopal Church, we do this through our diocesan systems. So you've got the congregation here. There's all of our congregants sitting there. Then the congregation gives some of their baptismal authority to the vestry. The vestry is elected by the congregation. And then that vestry, in turn, is the one that calls the rector, sets who the wardens are for the church. So in the congregation sharing their baptismal authority to a different level, they are simultaneously participating in every level. So that's important. Similarly, if you take this out even to the next level, so we've got congregation, vestry, then you've got the vestry, and sometimes it depends on where you are again, but sometimes it is the congregation themselves that elect members to go to diocesan convention, which is called diocesan, what is it called here? It's called something different. Council. Diocesan council is here in this diocese. But same concept. So you get delegates, all the clergy get to go to diocesan council, and then the delegates from each of the different congregations are elected and sent to represent their congregation in the diocesan council. Similarly, when the bishop is not there, it is the different standing committees that have the authority of the church. And when the bishop's position is vacant, it is the convention that actually calls and elects the bishop. So again, by you participating in this system, you are participating in the election of the bishop and setting the tone for the diocese. So quick questions about this real quick.
Excuse me. The slides will be available.
I've got some printed versions of the slides that people are able to take home with you. We're not going to send these out digitally because they're not ready for that. These are not ready for publication, but you can take them with you today. Good. So, any other questions real quick? Perfect. So, we're going to move up to another level then. So this is at the diocesan level, but then think about how every diocese has a similar structure to this that makes up our entire province. So then the diocesan convention or council, that's the word again, they elect deputies to go to what is known as general convention. So we're moving out even further. So these deputies from general convention get to go. So you get 4 lay deputies, 4 clergy deputies, and they are elected to what is known as the House of Deputies. And then they elect the president of the House of Deputies. Every bishop in the Episcopal Church also gets to go to general convention, and they make up what is known as the House of Bishops. So we have a bicameral system. This comes to being roughly at the same time as the American Revolution is happening. So at the same time that we're deciding how we want to govern our country, the same people are actually involved in how we want to govern our church. And so we get this very unique system that looks very different from almost any other Anglican province in the world. So when the General Convention makes decisions about the life of the church, these are binding because this is our structure. So when we set precedent, when we set resolutions, those go out to all the dioceses and are part of what we believe. So when we have contentious things like women's ordination, gay marriage, when those are set by General Convention, for us as Episcopalians, that is binding. So that's an important note to have. Where was I going with that? So the difference between us and a lot of the other churches, so we have in the Church of England a little bit of a different polity. I couldn't find a good map, so apologies for that. But we have to think about this. The monarch is still the head of the Church of England. So King Charles gets to make decisions about the Church of England. King Charles is actually the one that appoints bishops. There is no elections in Church of England. So the government actually sends names to King Charles to then have him select from the slate. it's usually, here's the one name and he appoints them. But when we talk about the separation of church and state, we're often talking about how the church isn't involved in government. But it swings the other way for us too, in that we're talking about the government is not involved in how we as a church get to operate. And I think that that is just as important to us as people of faith, of that we have our own autonomy in how we're making these decisions. So the archbishops and bishops are appointed by the monarch under advisement from the parliament, and then they have what is known as a general synod, which is similar to the general convention, except all of these different, it's a question of how you get to go and have representation there. Just that's an easy way to put it. And so it's not as open as we have it in that each parish and diocese is electing people to go. A lot of these are appointed positions that you get to go. And so the representation of the church just looks different, and the way in which something happens within the church looks different. I think what I was going to say here was that with our bicameral system, something has to go to both of the houses before it becomes a passed resolution, similar to how we make a legislation here. So that's important as well. Think of the House of Bishops as the Senate, because they have lifetime approval, lifetime appointments to the House of Bishops. The House of Deputies is more of the House of Representatives, because they are only elected for that particular General Convention, and General Convention only meets every 3 years. All right, that was a lot for that, but I think that's helpful in terms of talking about what happens when we disagree. So if you have something that comes out of one church that a different church disagrees with, what is the structure? And how do we have that debate and conversation? And that's essentially what the 4 instruments of communion are there to help us with. So a pressing one for the Anglican Communion within the last 20 years has been the conversation about LGBT inclusion in the church. So we're going to look at this as a case study, and we're not looking at every aspect of this story because it's a massive one, but we're going to look at the ways in which the instruments of communion and some of the polity of the church has been involved. So just look at it through that lens, because we're going to leave a lot of stuff out here for the life of today, because this is a very important debate. So just looking at some historical notes here. So 1994 is when the General Convention of the Episcopal Church amends the canons to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, thus providing equal access to the rites and worship of the Episcopal Church, including ordination. So at this point, there are churches that start to do gay weddings, same-sex blessings, same-sex weddings, but not all of them. So it's still diocesan, or it's diocese by diocese for a long time in the church. But that's its own process within General Convention of starting this conversation. Sort of in response to that, so the Episcopal Church is the first church in the Anglican Communion to do this. In 1998, at the Lambeth Conference that happens that year, they passed what is known as Resolution 1.10, which just as a reminder, this is not binding to any Episcopal church. This is just setting tone for what the bishops think of as where the church should be going. So in 1998, they passed this resolution on human sexuality that defines marriage as between one man and one woman. It defines homosexuality as incompatible with Scripture, but at the same time, it upholds the dignity of LGBT individuals as full members of the body of Christ, and it condemns violence against LGBT individuals. So it's doing a couple of things there, but this is not binding to the Episcopal Church. It's a way of talking about what is the general consensus of most of the Anglican Communion. So that's similar. That's kind of what's happening in that. In 2002, Gene Robinson is consecrated as the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. We're actually at the 20th anniversary of that this week. So this is a big moment in the life of our church to say that an openly gay individual can be part of the entire governing structure. And so this creates a lot of division within the church, because at this point, and it's similar with just where America is at that point, there's a lot of disagreement on this. And so many congregations attempt to kind of break away from the Episcopal Church, and some succeed. And we get what is known for the first time as ACNA, which is the Anglican Church in North America, which is a breakaway province, a way to say, in the terms that we're talking about. Now, the key difference with ACNA is that they are not recognized by the Archbishop of Canterbury, thus meaning that they are not a part of the Anglican Communion. So they are Anglican in their name, they are a valid expression of Christian worship, but they are not part of the Anglican Communion, and they have no connection to the Episcopal Church. A good thing just to know in general is that you, as members of Christ in St. Luke's, do not own this building. This is not yours. This is the diocese. This is part of the Episcopal Church. Every Episcopalian technically owns this building. So if you get in a disagreement with the leadership at any level, just know that you can choose to walk away, but this is not yours. And so there's been lots of court battles and lots of ways in which churches tried to leave and take the physical property with them. So this has been a really horrible 20 years in the life of the church with lots of disagreement, but we've done a lot of work to get through this, and we've not, we've stood by our understandings that this is the life, this is the way that we want to go. Full inclusion of LGBT individuals in the life of our church is not something that we're willing to compromise on. So, yes?
How many ACNA churches are there?
I don't know the actual number. So ACNA is the largest of the kind of structures. There are several Anglican breakaways that have different names because they also cannot disagree on what they disagree on. So,
Are they all under African bishops? One African bishop, several? What's the story?
So we're going to talk about that. Okay. 1 second, Curtis. So we've got ACNA that pops up in 2002, and you start to have these breakaway churches. Is there another hand in the back?
Well, I do, but my sister's part of the South Carolina Episcopal Diocese, and the diocese left.
The whole diocese tried to leave.
And
Yeah.
is there another group that, they call themselves Anglican, as you say,
Mm-hmm.
and the service is exactly the same. There's actually no difference in it.
A lot of those churches use the 1928 prayer book versus the 1979, but yeah, very similar structure.
I think hers does.
Yeah.
But they got to keep their church because that church was given to them by people that owned the property.
Mm-hmm.
Like a 20 years court case.
The case in South Carolina has been the one that has differed from the way a lot of the court cases have gone. So. Truro Parish up in Virginia, Falls Church up in Virginia, they got their parish back. There's lots of ways we could have this conversation, but just know that this issue has created lots of strife, not only within our own church, but also within the entire Anglican communion. So that's what we're going to move next to.
Is there any chance that they'll come back?
I hope so. I mean, that's part of how we walk in relationship is that, and I think the place that we're going to get to in terms of the conversation of Anglicanism, I think might help us in how we do reconciliation with our brothers and sisters that we have disagreements with in our own context. So let's look a little bit at that. In 2008, what is known as GAFCON forms. So this forms at the same time that the next Lambeth Conference is happening. So you remember the 1998 Lambeth Conference happens. This is the next one, and 10 years later, where GAFCON forms, which is the Global Anglican Futures Conference. It's mainly, it's all relatively conservative bishops and leaders of the church that form what they see not necessarily as a separate Anglican communion, but a conference to say that what is happening in the Anglican communion is not what they agree with. So this is another pretty divisive piece in our history, and it's still something that's happening. They put out a statement that basically talks about how many of the churches, it's not only an LGBT issue, it's women's ordination, it's a lot of things that we have really dug our heels into that they have issues with. And so they formed this conference, and it leads to a 2008 Lambeth conference that is very divisive, so highly contentious. Most of the GAFCON bishops refuse to attend if the Episcopal Church is invited at all. I don't think that ends up happening, but what does happen is that Gene Robinson was not invited to attend, which was a really hurtful thing, not only for him, but for all of the Episcopal Church, in saying that this duly elected and properly ordained bishop of our church is being excluded. And so that was a major piece of contention in the 2008 Lambeth Conference. So after 2008, the debate in terms of the communion really takes the shape of like, we don't know if we can stay together, because at this point it is the Episcopal Church, it's the Anglican Church of Canada and the Anglican Church in Brazil that have taken this stance on LGBT issues. All of the other churches in the Anglican Communion still have rules barring ordination for LGBT individuals, especially as they get into bishops. So even the Church of England, is that still correct? Yes, bishops cannot be gay individuals in the Church of England. And so that's a major conversation that the church in England is having still to this day.
They can be, they just can't.
They can't be openly, that's right, that's what it is.
So, I mean, it's a legal fiction in a way.
That's right,
Yeah, I mean, the military got rid of that too.
that's right. And so lots of stuff happens in 2008. I'm missing a slide here, but in the Episcopal Church in 2016, right after the Supreme Court decision that legalizes gay marriage in the United States, the General Convention that year sets precedent that these are all fine. And the Episcopal Church basically comes into a full understanding that gay marriage and full inclusion of LGBT individuals in the life of the church is precedent. So when the General Convention passes that, that is binding for our church. Now, there are different dioceses that had to figure out workarounds, but we're not going to get into that right now. But essentially, that is set doctrine for us now. That is a set belief, and there's no going away from that unless General Convention changes it, which is not going to happen because we've gone through this hard work to get to this place. But in taking that hard stance, the 2020... It would have been the 2018 Lambeth Conference. Because of how much contention there was in the Anglican Communion at that point, they decided to bump it to 2020. The Archbishop of Canterbury needed 2 more years to kind of corral all of the bishops to say, come together to the table and help us form this relationship. Because that's what we have as Anglicans, is relationship. So if we're not willing to walk together despite our differences, we've lost everything. And so he needs 2 more years to kind of corral people. And then what happens in 2020? COVID. So it gets bumped another 2 years. So 2022 is the next Lambeth Conference after 2008. So 14 years, which that's a long time. And it's a long time in where the world is on some of these issues too. And so lots has changed. But then what happens, let me look at the time. We got time. All right, good. The mechanisms for which the conversations at Lambeth happen and are disseminated out change every year. Sometimes they're resolutions. They decided to do away with resolutions at the 2022 because they didn't think they were ever going to get to a place of commonality where they could pass something. So they did something called a Lambeth Call. And so the hope of a Lambeth Call is to ground Anglican thought biblically and develop language that describes our common mission in the world. So these are very long documents about lots of different conversations. And there was one specifically on the topic of human dignity. So if you will, I'm just going to read this aloud. This is part of the call. This is part of the, what do they call it? Basically, there was a preamble that did a lot of theological work, and then there were specific bullets below the preamble that talked about some of the commonalities and disagreements that we have. So this is part of the preamble here. It is the mind of the Anglican Communion that acts and attitudes against the dignity of God's children are sin. The legacies of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and other abuses of power continue to impact our communities. Some have been enriched and some impoverished. International economic systems built upon unjust structures of exploitation have created dehumanizing conditions. The deep inequalities in access to land, health, and education, exploitation of the young, unjust labor practices, mistreatment of ethnic minorities, migrants, and refugees, the inhumanity of human trafficking, religious persecution, pressures on those guided by their freedom of conscience, oppression of LGBTQ persons, gender-based violence, war, and sexual violence and conflict, in part, reveal such sin. Hospitality to all and faithfulness to each are key marks of a godly community. So similar to what they did with that resolution in 1998, this contextualizes that oppression of LGBTQ persons is sin. And that's huge, especially considering that many people in the Anglican Communion are living in places where it is illegal to be an LGBT person. And so to say, as an instrument of the communion, that oppression of LGBTQ persons is a sin is a major thing. And it goes further. And so this is one of the 2.3 here is talking about, it's one of the bullet points that comes after the preamble, but it says, prejudice on the basis of gender and sexuality threatens human dignity. Given Anglican polity, and especially the autonomy of the provinces, there is disagreement and a plurality of views on the relationship between human dignity and human sexuality. Yet we experience the safeguarding of dignity and deepening dialogue. It is the mind of the Anglican Communion as a whole that all baptized, believing, and faithful persons, regardless of sexual orientation, are full members of the body of Christ, and to be welcomed, cared for, and treated with respect. Referring back to Resolution 10.10 in 1998. Many provinces continue to affirm that same-gender marriage is not permissible. Again, referring back to Resolution 1.10, states that legitimizing or blessing of same-sex unions cannot be advised. Other provinces have blessed and welcomed same-sex union and marriage after careful theological reflection in a process of reception. As bishops, we remain committed to listening and walking together to the maximum possible degree, despite our deep disagreement on the issues. Now that might sound like it's just listing two things, but this is a major point for us in that this, and Bishop Curry is going to say the same thing in just a second, but this is the first time any document that has the Anglican Communion's name on it has listed that there is a plurality of views on this in the communion and that both are valid. And so that is a really, it's not as far as we would like it to go, but it is a step, and it is a major step in a direction that we would like to see it go. So this is part of what the instruments of communion can do. And so again, this is Bishop Curry. This is our primate. This is the presiding bishop of the church, Bishop Curry. He said, "My friends, I've been," and this is directly after this Lambeth call. So this hour-long meeting in which they had this discussion, and this document is presented and discussed. But it says, "My friends, I've been a bishop for 22 years. I've been a priest for over 40, and I have to tell you that as far as I know, that it's the first time that a document in the Anglican Communion has recognized that there is a plurality of views on marriage, and that these are perspectives that reflect deep theological and biblical work and reflection. That they reflect and respect the context in which we live and seek to address the pastoral needs of our people, of all the children of God. That is why I say today is a hopeful day." So, again, not as far as we would like it to go, but in terms of how we continue to be in relationship with people, it's a major step. And so I think what this leads for us in terms of how we think about our work as Episcopalians moving forward is that if we break off all relationship with people, if we choose not to have the conversation at all because people disagree with us, we cannot advocate for our LGBT brothers and sisters in other parts of the world if we remove ourselves from that conversation. So being that this doesn't go nearly as far as we want, if we take away our conversation and our means of conversation, we might not get any further. So that is the power of communion. That is the power of these instruments. And this is just a very brief look at how one of the instruments of communion deals with disagreement. I imagine we have some questions. But
They are choosing to be in communion with the Episcopal Church. That's the really significant thing.
Well, that too, yeah. I mean, so I'm contextualizing it in the frame that we have actions to make too, but also it is other people that are choosing to be in relationship with us, even though we are in disagreement. And that is the whole power of the Anglican Communion, is that if we don't have relationship, we have nothing. We have no power, really. So that's interesting. Questions?
You said earlier, and we'll be addressing this later too, but you said something about the Church of England still not authorizing gay bishops for ordination, or bishops or priests, or just bishops?
I think just bishops. I get confused on it because every province is different.
And you said that those two things, ordination of women and gay bishops or priests, were the sort of the dividing factors?
Those are two of the big ones. There's lots of, instances,
right, but Church of England does have women bishops.
Mhm.
In fact, isn't there one, the Archbishop of Durham or something like that?
Yeah, women's ordination has been a big thing for them.
So how does that affect the fact that the Church of England does?
So GAFCON is bishops that are relatively conservative. So that comment was in relation to what is known as GAFCON, and that's where you get a lot of the southern bishops. So a lot of the bishops that are in Africa and in different spots are leading the GAFCON movement. Church of England, to my knowledge, doesn't have any bishops that are a part of GAFCON. So that's different, yeah.
Okay, so GAFCON is still hanging to on that principle of
Yes.
no women, okay.
I think this is an excellent illustration of something that we should be doing politically.
Mm.
I mean, we are so divided politically at this point. And just to say, okay, well, we're still Americans. We can still have dialogue.
Yeah.
We can still be in communion, even though we have differences of opinion.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think that is a huge piece of what the value of the Anglican Communion is how to represent to others how to be in relationship, even in disagreement, because that's really what we have. We're not going to agree about anything. Good Lord, if we agreed about everything, it would be boring. And so maybe that's a good way to pivot to sort of the next conversation, which is what we're going to pick up next week. So why do we need the communion? Well, because we have the strength in numbers. If we can get these 10 million people working towards a common mission and vision, we have the ability to make a lot of change in the world. And so just briefly, I wanted to look at, these are some of the networks that you can be a part of as an Anglican, and just look at all of the different areas where we have commonality that can be worked on. So the youth network is huge. Healthcare and community networks throughout the Anglican Communion are massive. I worked at this hospital here, which is in the mountains of Lesotho. And so that is funded by Anglican Communion partners all throughout the world to be this remote health center for a health services area where it's a 10-hour horseback ride to get to the hospital. So if you have a heart attack, the reality of the world is, you're not going to make it. So how we fund this and how we are in relationship with people has a real impact. It's a life and death scenario in lots of worlds. So there's liturgical networks, peace and justice networks to do some of this work in our contextual neighborhoods. Indigenous network is huge because of the legacy of colonialism, because of the legacy of how the church gets to where the church is, how we incorporate lament and how we repent for a lot that we've done to our Indigenous brothers and sisters is huge. So that's a very important network as well. Colleges and universities, education is massive in the Anglican Communion, so that's a really important network. The environmental network, if we could get the entire Anglican Communion sharing the goals of climate change and how we can address some of the major issues of our world, that's real impacts in our communities that we will benefit from because our basement won't flood anymore, and that's fantastic. Interfaith network is really one too, and then the women's network. The average Anglican, if you look at those 10 million members, the average Anglican is a woman living in sub-Saharan Africa. Like that is, if you look at the statistics of who we are, the demographics of who we are, women play a major role in the life of the church. And so the women's network is another massive way to be involved with different people. Yes?
Does Christ Pacifics have
a parallel link to these networks? In other words, is there like a committee or group or team that does each of these things here in our church?
Not that I'm aware of. So a lot of the Anglican Communion networks, and we'll pick up on this next week because I know we're close on time, but a lot of the work that we do is based off people's own connections to these things. So this doesn't necessarily need the institutional Christ in St. Luke's for you to be involved. You can go and be involved. You can get on this network website and find places where this is happening and be kind of that network. So we have a church hierarchy that is very specific in how we make goals for and resolutions for the entire church, but the actual mission and work that we do can be any of us working. So there's ways to be involved that are not necessarily connected to the full institutional model of the church. You know, that's the power of the Anglican Communion, I think, is that you sitting here at Christ in St. Luke's have a direct connection to any of the parishioners that are at St. James Parish Church, which is in Mansignane. You have, it's not 6 degrees of separation. You know, we can get there much quicker than those 6 degrees, I promise you, to anyone in the world. So I think that that's power. We're at time. I know there's probably lots of questions, but we'll pick up next week to look at some of this work, because I think that this is actually really important to who we are and to the life of the church. So we'll pick up right there. Thanks, everybody.